welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different. Not just looking at a text, but really performing a kind of intellectual excavation. We're going deep into the foundations, maybe the deepest foundations of Western philosophy, trying to pinpoint that moment where the very idea of what it means to be got defined.
That's a great way to put it. We're looking at a kind of philosophical fault line, a split that really set the course for everything that came after in Western thought.
Right.
And you can't really grasp Aristotle, I think, without understanding who he was pushing back against and, why he felt he had to take apart their arguments piece by piece.
So our mission today is to really get into Aristotle's critique of, the pre-Socratic giant, Parmenides. Yeah. We'll be focusing on physics 1.3 mostly, but trying to see it in its broader historical context.
Yeah.
Because this clash, it wasn't just some academic debate. It feels more like the moment classical philosophy built its framework, laid the foundations for what Whitehead famously called that long series of footnotes to Plato.
And that Platonic Aristotelian framework, that whole metaphysical system, it's kind of the intellectual water we swim in, isn't it?
It really is.
Which makes understanding someone like Parmenides, who comes before all that, really challenging for us now. We're essentially trying to read a pre-metaphysical text, a kind of proto-metaphysics, using the very tools and categories that came after it, the tools it helped create, in a way.
Okay, so let's lay out the opposing sides here. We've got Parmenides on one side, this foundational thinker, arguing for reality as, a pure, single, undifferentiated being?
Exactly. Undifferentiated is key.
And then on the other side, Aristotle, the ultimate organizer, the systematizer. And his philosophy seems to define being only by looking at specific, concrete, definable things. Determinate entities.
That's the core conflict, yes. And the big question we need to keep asking ourselves throughout this is, did Aristotle just fundamentally miss Parmenides' point? Did he apply his own definitional lens to an idea that was meant to be beyond definition?
Or was his critique actually the necessary step, the intellectual move that had to happen to shift philosophy from thinking about pure accessibility, pure isness, towards the formal, structured metaphysics that, dominated Western thought ever since?
That's the crux of it.
So to navigate this, we need some tools to help us see the maybe inherent bias in Aristotle's approach. We mentioned using the Heideggerian framework as a kind of interpretive lens.
Right. And the two main concepts we'll need to keep tracking are being with a capital B sign in German, which is existence itself, the sheer fact that things are, versus beings, lowercase b docenda, which are just the specific things that exist. This chair, that idea, you, me, particular entities.
Okay. So the fight is between Parmenides' idea of being as this pure, undifferentiated accessibility and Aristotle's way, which immediately jumps to being as determinate beingness, and definable what it is, which he calls ousia.
Yes, ousia. That Greek term becomes absolutely central. The whole debate really pivots on what that word means and how it's used.
All right, let's unpack this distinction then. Being versus beings. Because you said it's like the hidden gravity shaping Aristotle's whole way of thinking. When we talk metaphysics, we mean the study of reality's structure, right?
Fundamentally, yes. And one way to look at the whole Platonic Aristotelian tradition through that Heideggerian lens we mentioned is that it tries to talk about being as such sign, but it only ever really manages to grasp it by looking at being's daseienda.
How so?
Well, think about it. When we ask the big question, what is being? What do we immediately do? We start listing the things that are. We look for common features. We shift from the sheer fact that things exist to the shared structure, the sort of beingness, Seinheit is the German term, that all existing things seem to have in common.
Okay, I see. So asking what something is already pushes us away from just its raw existence and towards its definition, its properties, its category.
Precisely. And this is where that Greek term ousia really steps onto the main stage. It becomes the philosophical keyword. The focus shifts entirely towards defining what makes particular things stable, identifiable, what gives them a permanent structure. We stop looking at the vast ocean of existence itself and start examining the specific ships sailing on it, if you like that analogy.
I do. And ousia itself has a history, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just invented as a philosophical term out of nowhere?
No, absolutely not. Heidegger makes a big point about this. Before it became the term for essence or substance, ousia in everyday Greek often meant something more like property, estate, possessions, things you own.
Ah, so there's an inbuilt bias towards the tangible, the present, the thing you can point to.
There's a subtle pull in that direction, yes. Towards the immediate, the accessible, the controllable. It implies that being is fundamentally something at hand, something present.
So the core term for reality structure is already tying reality to presence.
It's deeply intertwined. Ousia connects to parousia, which means something like beingness at hand, or maybe better, constant presence. Estandage Anwesenheit in German.
Constant presence.
Yeah. And arguably, the great achievement of classical metaphysics, Plato and Aristotle, is that it zeroes in on stability, self-identity, constant presence as the markers of what's truly real. These are the criteria for how determinate beings are accessible to us, knowable. If something is always changing, fleeting, metaphysics tends to see it as somehow less real than what's stable and always present.
And when Aristotle takes this concept, ousia, he gives it a very specific job in his system, doesn't he? It becomes the substantial mode of being. How does that refine or maybe lock in this bias towards presence and definition?
It locks it in by making ousia the absolute foundation for everything else. In Aristotle's categories, ousia refers to the entity that can act as the substrate, the hypokinetic.
An underlying thing.
Yes, the underlying reality that supports all the other ways things can be, like qualities, quantities, relations, place, time. All those depend on there being a substance first. If I say, this podcast is interesting, the podcast itself is the ousia, the substance, and interesting is a quality that depends on it.
So the structure of reality ends up mirroring the structure of a basic sentence. The subject, the noun, that's the ousia, the substance. And all the adjectives and predicates are just secondary dependent ways of being.
That's a really crucial connection. We can't overstate how important that link between ontology and grammar becomes in Aristotle. His whole metaphysical project, his leading question, or Leitfrage, which asks about being qua being.
Yes, being.
Right, being insofar as it is being. That question for Aristotle is fundamentally about pinning down ousia as the core beingness, the scientite of all beings. And the whole point of doing that is to map out the categories, the rules that say what it means for any particular thing to be. It's about finding the universal structures, the koinon, shared by all the specific things that exist.
So Aristotle wants the ultimate rule book for classifying everything. All the particular things. But pre-Socratics, like Parmenides, they were doing something else entirely before that.
They really were. Pre-Socratic thought, this is Heidegger's first inception, der erste Anfang. It's a kind of proto-metaphysics happening before the formal classifying project gets going. Their focus seems to be more on being as pure accessibility, pure abiding in presence. Anwesenheit. They're looking at the sheer fact that there is something, rather than trying to define that something in universal terms.
Let me try an analogy again. Maybe the pre-Socratics were asking about the basic conditions for light to exist at all.
Yeah, I like that.
Whereas Aristotle immediately starts sorting everything the light reveals into colors, shapes, sizes.
That's a very good analogy. The pre-Socratics are looking at the fundamental isness before that isness gets conceptualized as a common feature shared by all the particular determinate beings. The Platonic Aristotelian move is the real start, chronologically, of metaphysics proper, because it takes that raw accessibility and immediately channels it into definition and categories.
Okay.
And that shifts the whole game. Away from the sort of undifferentiated mystery of existence towards the differentiated, understandable whatness of particular things.
Right. This is where we have to do the really difficult work. Trying to think about being the way Parmenides did before Aristotle's categories took over. So his poem, The Journey to Aletheia, what's going on there?
Okay, so the poem describes this journey the thinker takes, guided by a goddess beyond the familiar paths, the roads of night and day. These represent the basic oppositions, light, dark, hot, cold, coming to be, passing away, that structure our everyday reality. The destination is Aletheia.
Often translated as truth.
Usually, yes, but maybe better understood here as something like unconcealment, or the most fundamental level of intelligible evidence, the place where things are revealed as they truly are without the usual oppositions.
And the goddess, interestingly, she doesn't just say, ignore everyday experience, it's all fake. She actually tells the thinker to understand the doxai, the opinions, the appearances, what mortals accept as real.
This is so important. It stops us from reading Parmenides too simplistically as just denying the reality we see. The doxai aren't just illusions or mistakes to be discarded. They are, in a way, the necessary structure of how being appears to us in our everyday changing experience.
Necessary structure.
Yes. The thinker has to understand how what is accepted, tado kanta, had to be there acceptably, dokumusaitai, how this world of appearances fits together, how it functions. Parmenides seems to accept that the world structured by mortal opinions is there, but it's somehow secondary, derived from a deeper, more fundamental reality.
Okay, so the core insight isn't just psychological about our minds. It's a claim about thought itself, that whatever I can meaningfully think about must, in some sense, be accessible. It must be there for thought.
That's the connection, the famous fragment B3. For being aware, no, and being there, I know one and the same. Now, if we read this like Descartes, I think, therefore I am, we completely miss it.
Right, it's not subjective idealism.
No, it's about thinking as pure receptivity to what is intelligible. Consciousness nous is the clearing, the open space where being can appear.
Okay, so if thinking is fundamentally receiving or accessing what is, then what is not? Non-being has to be completely shut out. You can't think it. It's inaccessible.
Exactly. That strict exclusion of non-being, that's the logical engine driving everything else. It leads directly to the conclusion that being must be utterly self-identical. It must be eternal, indivisible, unchanging, and totally unified. One single thing.
Why indivisible?
Because if you could divide it, what would be between the parts?
Nothing. None.
Yeah, precisely. And non-being is unthinkable, impossible. So being must be a complete, seamless whole. A perfect sphere, as he famously describes it.
Let's try and nail down this unified thing then. To eon, what does that phrase actually mean?
To eon, it's a neuter participle, basically meaning the being thing, or that which is. It points to the sheer there-ness, the simple presence of reality. The fundamental is there. It's being in the most minimal sense possible. Undifferentiated intelligibility itself before we carve it up with concepts or names for specific things.
And this leads to his claims about time, which always sounds so strange to us.
They do. He argues powerfully that being exists now, non estin, all at once, as a unified whole, hen, and constantly, continuously. He really leans on the aspect of the Greek verb einai, to be, that implies duration, ongoing presence.
So no past, no future.
For being itself, fundamentally no. Being never was, or will be, estai, it just is, perpetually right now. Any idea we have of something being past or future is just, for Parmenides, a way mortals misunderstand this enduring constant presence.
So if I think about, say, Plato writing the Republic, that event is past for us. But for Parmenides, the fact that it's accessible to my thought right now means it participates in being, which is always present.
That's the challenging implication, yes. Its intelligibility guarantees its being there in this fundamental sense, irrespective of our usual temporal categories. If being is this primal, self-contained accessibility, it can't really be broken down or described using terms that imply non-being, like change or difference or plurality.
Which means all the names we use for specific things, trees, rocks, people, change itself.
Ultimately, from the perspective of aletheia, they are just names mortals assign, names for different aspects or appearances of the one reality to eon, or perhaps better, names for accessibility itself.
And his followers, Zeno and Melissus, they really ran with that implication, didn't they?
They did. They became famous for developing paradoxes aimed at proving that motion, plurality, and change are logically impossible, just illusions based on faulty mortal assumptions. And that is the extreme view that Aristotle feels he absolutely has to refute.
Because it poses a fundamental problem. If there's only one unchanging being, how on earth do we explain the world we actually experience, which is full of different things, constantly changing? Right.
Aristotle comes at this from a completely different angle. His work, especially the physics, starts with observation. It has to provide a coherent, systematic explanation of the natural world, physis. And that means explaining change, motion, becoming kinesis or metaboly.
So his first job is to show why his predecessors, particularly the Eleatics, Parmenides' followers, failed so spectacularly at explaining change.
Exactly. He sees their denial of change, the idea that it's impossible, as stemming directly from that core Eleatic principle, the absolute exclusion of non-being.
Can you walk us through the logical bind they created?
Okay, the Eleatics set up a strict dichotomy. Being is, non-being is not. So they ask, if something is going to come into being, where does it come from?
Two options, right?
Two options. Either it comes from something that already is, but that's impossible, they say, because if it already is, it can't come to be, it's already there. Or the only other option, it must come from nothing, from absolute non-being.
Which they've already ruled out as impossible and unthinkable.
Exactly. Since non-being is utterly nothing, it can't be the source of anything. Therefore, they conclude, coming to be, and by extension all change, is logically impossible. QED.
They've logicked themselves into a corner where the obvious reality of change can't exist.
That's how Aristotle sees it. He thinks they created this trap by eliminating any possible role for non-being. And in doing so, he argues, they overlooked the necessary condition for any change to occur. There has to be some underlying thing that persists through the change, something that must lie beneath. Hypokaistai.
The substrate again.
The substrate, yes. If something changes from, say, cold to hot, there must be something, water, air, whatever, that was cold and becomes hot. That thing persists.
And Aristotle's claim is that the Eleatics, in their search for the ultimate, abstract, unified being, just completely ignored physis. Nature, in his sense.
They basically missed the subject matter of physics entirely. Physis, for Aristotle, is the realm of things that have an internal principle of movement and rest. It's the world of space, time, matter, and becoming. Aristotle accuses the Eleatics of a kind of category error, a domain confusion.
So?
They failed to distinguish between physis, the study of the sensible changing world, and what we might call first philosophy or metaphysics, the study of unchanging, perhaps divine principles, or the highest, most perfect entity.
So they took an insight that might belong to theology or pure logic, that ultimate being must be simple, unchanging, perfect.
Maybe, yes.
And they wrongly applied that standard to everything, including everyday objects that clearly do change.
That's Aristotle's diagnosis. It was a massive conceptual overreach. The kind of discourse they ended up with, focusing only on eternal unity, might be fine for talking about God, maybe, but it simply could not be physics because it denied the very possibility of the physical world's most obvious feature change. It was a kind of non-physical, metaphysical physics.
But he does seem to cut Parmenides himself a little slack compared to Zeno and Melissus. He calls him somewhat more perceptive. Why?
Aristotle seems to think Parmenides maybe sensed the difficulty. He speculates that perhaps Parmenides meant his unity thesis to apply primarily on the level of logic or meaning kata ton logon, that conceptually being must be one and unchanging.
Wow.
But that maybe Parmenides still acknowledged on some level the appearance of multiplicity and change in the world of the sensus kata ton aisthesin.
So the idea is Parmenides prioritized the logical unity but didn't outright deny sensory experience, unlike maybe Zeno, whose paradoxes seem aimed at demolishing sensory evidence.
That seems to be Aristotle's reading, yes. Parmenides' core claim was about the unified meaning of being as intelligible accessibility, perhaps not a crude claim that only one physical object exists. But even so, Aristotle argues, even this more subtle Parmenides failed because his starting points, the univocity of being and the strict exclusion of non-being, still led to the unacceptable conclusion that change is impossible.
Okay, so before Aristotle can build his own positive account of physics, he has to tear down those two pillars of Eleatic thought, right?
Yeah.
As he does in Physics 1.3. Pillar 1, the idea that being is univocal has only one meaning.
Right.
And pillar 2, the idea that only being is, and non-being, tomon, absolutely is not.
Those are the two targets he has to neutralize.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty logic here. Aristotle uses that classic method, reductio ad absurdum. Show the premise leads to nonsense. How does he attack the idea that being has just one simple meaning?
He starts by tackling the Eleatic conclusion. If being is said in only one way, then everything that is one. Aristotle says, hold on, even if we grant your premise that being is univocal, your conclusion doesn't follow.
And this is where he uses the analogy with white. We need to go to this carefully.
We do. Okay, argument 1. Refuting the univocity of being, the predicate problem. Aristotle says, let's imagine, just for argument, that the word white has only one single absolute meaning. Now consider all the things that are white. Let's say some chalk, some snow, a swan. They all share this single property, white. Does it follow that the chalk, the snow, and the swan are actually one single thing?
No, obviously not. There's still three different white things.
Exactly. Aristotle points out the mistake. To be white is not the same concept as to be something that has received the property of whiteness. The underlying things, the substrates, the hypokaimena, chalk, snow, swan, remain distinct, a multiplicity. They are different subjects sharing one predicate.
Okay.
So apply the same logic to being. Even if it is a being applies univocally to everything that exists, the individual things, that's the zenda, it applies to still remain multiple and distinct. A single meaning for the term being doesn't force us to accept a single entity that is being.
That seems like a pretty clean logical takedown of the inference. But Aristotle goes deeper, doesn't he? Questioning whether being even works like a normal predicate like white.
He does. He suggests there's a fundamental problem with treating being as if it were just another quality. It's not a real predicate, as Kant would later put it. Saying a unicorn is doesn't seem to add a property to the concept of unicorn in the same way that saying a unicorn is white does.
Right, it just asserts its being.
Its instantiation, maybe, its capacity to have predicates. So if the Eleatics insist being is a single definable property like whiteness, they run into these sorts of conceptual problems, forcing them towards denying change or making odd claims about attributes.
Which leads straight into his second argument against univocity, focusing on substance.
Right. Argument 2. Refuting univocity, the substantial being problem. Aristotle says, okay, let's push this univocity idea. If being has only one meaning, what could that meaning be? Maybe, he suggests, the Eleatics mean it signifies thinghood itself, pure substance, what as such is and as such is one hoperon. Let's assume being just means being a substance, ousia.
So only substances truly are.
If that's the single meaning of being, then anything that is not a substance like qualities, being white, quantities, being 6 feet tall, relations, being taller than someone, cannot be modes of being. They fall outside the only accepted category of what is.
And the absurdity there is?
The absurdity is that whiteness, tallness, etc. would have to be non-being, utterly without being. But that makes no sense, because it is clearly true to say Socrates is white or this wall is tall. We predicate these things of substances all the time.
So if these attributes were truly non-being, we couldn't truthfully say they exist at all, even as attributes of something else.
Precisely. The fact that we can truthfully predicate attributes proves they must have some kind of being. Therefore, Aristotle concludes, to be must be said in multiple ways. We have to distinguish at least between the being of a substance, Socrates, and the being of an attribute, Socrates white. Substantial being and accidental being.
So the univocity assumption just completely collapses under scrutiny. Being isn't one definable category or genus. It's spoken of in many related but different senses.
Exactly. It's fundamentally equivocal or maybe analogical for Aristotle, and nailing down that multiplicity is key.
Which then clears the path for tackling the second Eleatic pillar, the problem of non-being.
Yes, this is the really practical payoff for physics. Argument 3, distinguishing absolute and relative non-being. Aristotle actually agrees with the Eleatics on one basic point. Absolute non-being, the total opposite of being, pure nothingness, is indeed impossible as a source for anything. You can't get something from literally nothing. That's trivial.
But the Eleatics stopped there.
They did. They used the impossibility of absolute non-being to rule out change altogether. Aristotle's crucial move is to say, wait, there's another kind of non-being we need to consider. Meaningful non-being in a relative sense.
And this is the concept of privation, steresis.
Exactly. Relative non-being isn't unqualified nothingness. It's simply the absence or lack of a specific determinate quality or form. It's not being nothing, it's just not being such and such.
This table is not blue. It's not nothing, it just lacks blueness.
Perfect example. Or his classic one, a person who doesn't know music is unmusical. They are in a state of privation, steresis, relative to the form or attribute musicality. They absolutely exist as a person, they just lack that specific quality. They are relatively non-musical.
And this distinction is what unlocks the mechanism of change, metaboly, for him.
It's the key that solves the whole Eleatic puzzle. Change is no longer this impossible leap from absolute nothing to absolute being. Instead, Aristotle sees change as involving 3 things that are always present in some way. 1, the underlying substrate, the hypokimenon, the thing that persists. 2, the privation, the relative non-being, the lack of a certain form. And 3, the form itself, the attribute that comes to be possessed.
So using his example, the unmusical person, the person is the substrate.
All right.
Unmusical is the state of privation, relative non-being.
Yes.
And musical is the form they acquire. The person persists, but transitions from lacking the form to having the form.
Exactly. The subject, the person, doesn't pop into existence from nothing. They were already there. They just exchange a state of lacking an attribute for a state of possessing it. The persistent substrate makes the change understandable, while the relative non-being, the lack, provides the from which the change logically starts. By splitting non-being into these 2 senses, absolute and relative, Aristotle makes motion and becoming perfectly plausible and opens the door for a science of physis.
Okay, let's pull back and see the big picture. What does this whole demolition job mean? It seems like Aristotle's entire very effective critique of Parmenides rests on one huge fundamental assumption about what existence even means. an assumption that basically shaped the next 2,000 years of philosophy.
It really did. And that core assumption, which Aristotle didn't just use but actually formalized, is that being itself, auto to on, can't really mean anything other than being something determinate as such.
Yeah.
To hoperonti.
Being something determinate.
Yes. For Aristotle, to exist is to exist as something specific, something definable, something you can pin down in his categories.
Yeah.
It's this substance with these qualities in this place at this time. Existence is tied absolutely to definition.
So if I'm getting this right, Aristotle effectively changed the question. Parmenides was asking maybe, what is the nature of the pure is-there-ness?
Plausibly, yes.
And Aristotle answers by saying, well, let's talk about the nature of the things that are there. He immediately forces that abstract is there onto the grid of what it is, how it is, its definition.
That's a perfect way to put it. That move towards determination, definition, categorization, that becomes the primary way of accessing being. And this structures how Aristotle understands the unity of being. It's not the single, undifferentiated, seamless unity of Parmenides' sphere.
No.
Aristotle's unity is, well, hierarchical. He calls it pros hen unity, meaning in relation to one. All the different ways things can be, as qualities, quantities, relations, etc., they all get their meaning by referring back to the primary central meaning of being.
Which is
being a substance, ousia, entityness. Everything else only exists because it relates to or modifies a substance.
And that focus on the definable whatness, the eidos or form, that's the real legacy, isn't it? Linking the structure of reality itself to the structure of our language, our grammar, subject-predicate syntax becomes the map of being. Definition becomes the gold standard of philosophical knowledge.
That's where classical metaphysics really cements itself, and this loops us back to that Heideggerian perspective we started with. From that viewpoint, Parmenides was trying to talk about being in its raw, prediscursive, undifferentiated unity. The sheer accessibility before we start naming and sorting. Aristotle's critique, while brilliantly solving the problem of explaining change within his own framework, effectively shut down that earlier way of thinking. It established the rule that you can only think being through the beingness of specific, determinate beings, through ousia.
And seeing that historical trajectory, seeing how Western thought got locked into Aristotle's categories of determination, that's what motivates Heidegger's later, very difficult project. The call to think being without beings.
It seems to be. It's a radical attempt, maybe centuries late, to somehow recapture the spirit of Parmenides' first inception, but in a new way. Heidegger felt that the whole trajectory launched by Plato and Aristotle, the focus on definition, presence, making things available for categorization, and ultimately control, had run its course, exhausted its possibilities. Philosophy needed an other inception, der Anfang, a way of thinking that could encounter the is there without immediately forcing it into the what it is.
Wow. So the challenge that echoes down from this ancient debate is really profound. Is it even possible for us, steeped as we are in this Aristotelian definition-based way of thinking and speaking, to conceive of pure accessibility? The raw is there, without instantly slotting it into our mental categories. What would thinking even be if it wasn't based on defining subjects and assigning predicates? It forces you to question the very limits of language and thought itself. #outro. So today we really dug into that fundamental split between pre-Socratic and classical thought. We followed the path from Parmenides' radical idea of single, unchanging, intelligible being to Aristotle's systematic dismantling of that idea. We saw him attack the notion that being has only one meaning, using logic and that clever white analogy.
Right, the predicate problem.
And then crucially, how he resolved the paradox of change by making that vital distinction between absolute non-being, which is nothing, and relative non-being, or privation, the lack of a specific quality.
And it all really comes down to that fundamental disagreement, or maybe shift, in what existence itself is taken to mean. For Parmenides, maybe sheer accessibility. For Aristotle, it's always being something determinate.
Determinate what?
Exactly. And that insistence on determination, on definition, that's arguably the single most decisive turn in the entire history of Western philosophy, which leaves us maybe with a final thought to chew on. If our language itself, the way we structure sentences with subjects and predicates, is so deeply interwoven with Aristotle's categories of substance and attribute, of determination, and if Heidegger is right that we need to somehow think being without beings to get beyond that structure, is it actually possible? Can we use the very language that metaphysics built over millennia to think outside of that metaphysical framework? Or does our language itself keep us trapped within it?
A genuinely challenging question to end on, something to really reflect on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the absolute bedrock of Western philosophy.